What are the arguments in favor of premillennialism? Premillennialism begins with the exegesis of Revelation 19 and 20 with the argument that there is continuity between Revelation chapter 19 and Revelation chapter 20. In Revelation 19, it describes the coming of Jesus on a great white horse. Then I saw the heavens open, and behold, a white horse. One sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes wars. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems, and has a name written that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and the name by which he is called is the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on the white horses. And from his mouth comes a sharp sword with which he strikes down the nations. And he rules them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. And on his robe and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Well, anyway, it describes how he will come and he will slaughter the enemies of God, and the beast was captured along with the false prophet who were in his presence and had done the signs which he had deceived and received the mark of the beast, those who worship his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, and the rest of the slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the throne, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. And so here in chapter 19, it describes the coming of Christ on a great white steed, defeating the Antichrist, the beast, and his ideological comrade, the false prophet, and throwing them into the lake of fire. Well, then the 1,000 years of Revelation 20, it follows immediately upon the description of the coming of Christ on the great white horse. And if those chapters are in chronological sequence, then you would have to conclude that premillennialism is correct, that Christ comes, then the 1,000 years begin. Now, amillennialism has to demand that there is a recapitulation beginning in chapter 20. But there is no indication of this in the text itself. And later on in chapter 20, it'll mention that the beast and the false prophet are already in the lake of fire. So it speaks of the defeat of Satan. When the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison to come out and deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their numbers like the sand of the sea, and they marched up over the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints, the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and false prophet were. This suggests that this is in chronological sequence with chapter 19. In chapter 19, the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire, and now the defeat of Satan, he is added to their company. And so if Revelation 19 and 20 are read, and one can argue that they're most naturally read this way in chronological sequence, well then premillennialism follows. Premillennialists also argue that Satan is not presently bound. In Revelation 20 and verse 2, it speaks of the binding of Satan. They took the ancient servant, who's the devil and Satan, bound him for 1,000 years, threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. Now, amillennialists say that, well, Satan was bound at the beginning of the church age, but this doesn't really ring true. First Peter 5 and verse 8 says that Satan goes around like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. That doesn't sound very bound to premillennialists. The binding of Satan to the death and resurrection of Christ is permanent, one might argue, but this binding here is temporary because he must be loose for a little while after the 1,000 years are over. And thus these seem to be different bindings or different sorts of bindings, and therefore this one is a future one, not a recapitulation. Now, extra-biblical apocalyptics suggests a premillennial interpretation. If you compare the book of Revelation and its view of the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 with extra-biblical texts, well, Jewish eschatology in the first century of the Christian era developed a millennium-like concept as a stage which was a transition between earth and heaven. You'll read about this concept of a transitional period between earth and heaven in Jewish writings such as 2nd Enoch 33, 2nd Enoch 91, the fourth book of Ezra, and in the Mishnah Talmud, Sanhedrin 97a. When John used the concept of the millennium then, it was in a milieu in which people already understood a similar concept of an earthly kingdom in which there would be a place for the restored Jewish nation. And arguably John is building on this established apocalyptic notion of an earthly Davidic kingdom. As we've already seen, the earliest interpreters of Revelation were generally premillennial. This was discussed in Lecture 34. Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, Papias, Barnabas, and others. The rise of amillennial interpretation correlates with the rise of the hermeneutically illegitimate allegorical method of interpretation. And so the argument from church history is that the earliest interpreters generally were premillennial, although Justin Martyr does comment that many right-minded Christians held another view. As far as the two resurrections in Revelation chapter 20, the amillennial interpretation must see these two different resurrections in Revelation of being of two different sorts. The first a spiritual and the second one a physical resurrection. But it would seem more consistent to make both resurrections of the same sort, either both spiritual or, still better, both physical. The premillennial view says you should interpret them alike, and so you have a resurrection of the martyrs at the beginning of the millennium in Revelation 20, and then you have the resurrection of everybody else at the end of the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. And making them both literal, rather than making one spiritual, one literal, seems more consistent. Some Old Testament prophecies seem to require a millennium, premillennialists say. For example, in Isaiah 65, it speaks of a time when things will be so good that the youth will die at the age of 100, and he who fails to reach the age of 100 will be thought accursed. Well, this has not occurred historically. It probably it's described as in the new heavens and the new earth in Isaiah 65, but in the new heavens and new earth of Revelation 21 and 22, there's no death at all. The most logical place is to put this, if you take it literally, would be in the 1,000-year millennium. And other passages, such as Zechariah 14, Isaiah 19, even Jeremiah 31, might find their fulfillment most easily if you posit that there is such a transitional period between the present age and the new heavens and the new earth as the millennium. The millennium also serves other purposes in the plan of God, arguably. The millennium manifests the rule of God in history and allows for the redemption of creation, as described in Romans 8 and verse 21, where creation itself groans for the revealing of the sons of God. The millennium illustrates the persistence of evil. Even in a perfect environment, sin will rear up its ugly head just as soon as Satan is loosed. And the millennium allows time to clean house to prepare the world for the age to come. I now move on to a intra-premillennial debate having to do with the Great Tribulation.